The history of black slavery, particularly tied to the transatlantic slave trade, is a long, tragic, and deeply influential chapter of global history. It spans several centuries, beginning around the early 1500s and officially ending in the late 19th century, though the legacies of this system persist today. Here's a more detailed look at its key aspects. Origins of black slavery. The practice of slavery existed long before the transatlantic slave trade. Slavery in various forms had been part of human civilizations in Africa, Asia, Europe, and the Middle East for thousands of years. However, slavery in Africa before European intervention was often different from the chattel slavery that would come to characterize the transatlantic trade. In many African societies, enslaved people could eventually earn their freedom or become part of the local community. The transatlantic slave trade, 16th to 19th century. The transatlantic slave trade began in the early 16th century and continued into the 19th century, driven by European colonization of the Americas and the demand for labor to cultivate crops such as sugar, tobacco, and cotton. European powers, including Spain, Portugal, Britain, France, and the Netherlands, built vast trade networks, forcibly transporting Africans to the Americas. 1. The capture and transport of Africans. European traders, in cooperation with African rulers and merchants, captured or bought enslaved Africans, often as a result of wars or raids on neighboring communities. The enslaved were marched to coastal forts, where they were held before being loaded onto ships for the journey across the Atlantic Ocean, known as the Middle Passage. The Middle Passage was marked by horrifically crowded, unsanitary conditions. Many enslaved Africans died of disease, malnutrition, or abuse before even reaching the Americas. The Middle Passage. This voyage across the Atlantic could last anywhere from a few weeks to several months. The conditions were brutal, with many Africans shackled in the holds of ships, receiving minimal food and water. An estimated 12 to 15 million Africans were forcibly transported across the Atlantic, but around 2 million are thought to have died during the journey. Those who survived the Middle Passage were taken to auction houses in the Americas, where they were sold as property. Work and life in the Americas. The majority of enslaved Africans were taken to the Caribbean and South America, particularly Brazil, where the demand for labor on sugar plantations was high. The United States, particularly its southern states, also became a major destination, especially after the establishment of tobacco and cotton plantations. Once enslaved in the Americas, Africans were subjected to harsh labor conditions, working long hours under the constant threat of physical violence. They were treated as property, denied basic human rights, and were forbidden from learning to read or write. Families were often torn apart, as owners had the right to sell individuals at will. In the southern U.S., enslaved people were the backbone of the plantation economy, particularly in the production of cotton, which was a crucial export to Europe. Cultural resistance and survival. Despite these brutal conditions, enslaved Africans found ways to resist. This resistance took various forms, from open rebellion to subtle acts of defiance. Several famous slave rebellions took place, including the Stono Rebellion in 1739 in South Carolina and Nat Turner's Rebellion in Virginia in 1831. Enslaved people also preserved elements of their African culture. In music, dance, religion, and language, they adapted and merged African traditions with new influences in the Americas, leading to the birth of new cultural forms such as African American spirituals, Caribbean religious practices like Vodou and Santeria, and many others. Abolition movements and the end of slavery. The movement to abolish the slave trade and eventually slavery itself gained momentum in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Abolitionists, both black and white, fought to expose the brutality of the slave trade and slavery itself. 1. The British Abolition Movement. The British were the first to make significant strides toward abolition. Driven by activists such as William Wilberforce and Olaudah Equiano, a former slave who wrote a famous autobiography, Britain banned the transatlantic slave trade in 1807. However, slavery itself wasn't fully abolished in British colonies until 1833, following intense campaigns by abolitionists. The Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804. In the French colony of Saint-Domingue, modern-day Haiti, enslaved Africans launched a